The fog, the air we learn to breathe. A few days ago, I found myself thinking about air. Not because I couldn't breathe, but because I suddenly realized that some of the earliest air I ever learned to breathe had become so familiar I couldn't tell it was there. That's the strange thing about air. You don't notice it until you step into a different climate. Then one day, you look back and realize that wasn't just the weather. That was literally the atmosphere I learned to call normal. I think that's true of ideas too, especially the ideas we're given as children. When we're young, people begin handing us maps. Not literal maps, of course. Maps for understanding ourselves, maps for understanding the world, maps for understanding what is good, what is dangerous, who belongs, who doesn't. Most of the people handing us those maps usually aren't trying to limit us. They're trying to help us. They're passing along the best understanding they have, the stories that gave them meaning, the beliefs that helped them make sense of life, the maps that were first handed to them. That's how human beings have always learned. One generation teaches the next, not because we're trying to create harm most of the time, because we're trying to create safety to the best of our ability. Children don't evaluate those maps. They trust them. That's what children are supposed to do. They don't stop to ask, will this shape the way I experience the world when I'm 40? They simply breathe the air around them. And eventually, they call that air reality. For me, that atmosphere began settling in around the age of 6 or 7. That was when I was first handed the maps I would spend decades believing were simply the way things are. I didn't know I was living in fog. How could I? When you've never experienced another atmosphere, you assume the ones you've inherited is simply reality. Little by little, that atmosphere became part of me. The future felt extraordinarily fragile. It was as though a thin veil had settled over everything, quietly coloring the way I saw the world. Beneath everyday life lingered the sense that something catastrophic was always just beyond the horizon. There was a quiet but deeply persistent pressure to stay alert, to watch for signs, to wonder whether every new technology, every cultural shift, every way of living that seemed to drift from what I'd been taught was biblical might somehow signal that the end was drawing near. To be right, to make sure I believed the correct things. Even my own intuition often felt like something I shouldn't entirely trust. None of these ideas arrived all at once. They settled slowly, like mist, so slowly that I couldn't even see it happening. The surprising part is that the fog didn't begin lifting because I wanted different beliefs. It began lifting because I wanted to understand my own suffering. I wanted to understand why anxiety seemed to follow me everywhere, why perfectionism felt less like a personality trait and more like a survival strategy, why I procrastinated on the very things I longed to create, why hope often felt just out of reach, why relationships and friendships felt harder than I thought they should, why I constantly felt like I wasn't living as fully as I knew I could. Eventually, those questions became louder than my fear of asking them, and somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't simply examining ideas. I was beginning to notice the atmosphere those ideas had created inside me. That's what fascinates me now, because I think we often imagine beliefs as thoughts. But I'm not sure that's the whole story. Beliefs become expectations. Expectations become emotional habits. emotional habits become nervous system patterns, and eventually they become the way we experience reality itself. Ideas don't only live in our minds, they settle in our bodies, in our fascia, in the very network of our entire system. This is why these conversations matter so much to me. Not because I'm interested in proving someone wrong, and certainly not because I want to condemn Christianity. I know Christians whose lives radiate extraordinary compassion, humility, generosity, and love. I've also encountered interpretations that organize people around chronic fear. Fear of questioning, fear of uncertainty, fear of being wrong, fear of other people, fear of ourselves. Those are not the same thing, and I think we do everyone a disservice when we pretend they are. I've mentioned in prior Soul Talks before that I am very uninterested in asking who's right, and much more interested in asking what kind of human being does this way of seeing the world tend to cultivate? Does it make us more curious? Does it make us more compassionate? Does it make us more emotionally honest and available, more creative, more resilient, more capable of repairing relationships, more willing to love people who see the world differently than we do? Because eventually every worldview bears fruit, and fruit can be examined. Lately, I've wondered if we've become very good at arguing over leaves, while rarely examining the roots. We debate religion, politics, culture, morality, identity, all important conversations. But underneath so many of them live a quieter question. What emotional atmosphere are we creating? Because children are breathing it every single day, whether we realize it or not. They are breathing it. And one day, they'll call it normal, just like we did. Maybe that's why I called this episode The Fog. Not because anyone deliberately filled the air with it, but because fog has a way of becoming invisible to the people who've lived inside it the longest. You don't notice it while you're in it. You notice it when the sun begins to break through. What would happen if we become more interested in clearing the air than defending the weather? Before you head back down the trail, if no one has reminded you lately, you are allowed to ask honest questions. You are allowed to examine the air you've been breathing. You are allowed to discover that some of the fears you've carried were inherited rather than chosen. You are allowed to hold gratitude for the people who did the best they could with the maps they were given, while also being honest about the way those maps have shaped your life. Those two things can exist together. If you've been carrying anxiety, I hope you know there is nothing weak about wanting to understand it. If you've been carrying shame, I hope you know it doesn't have to write the rest of your story. If you've spent years feeling like you were surviving instead of living, I hope you know healing is so possible for you. And if curiosity has been quietly knocking at the door, I hope you'll let it in. May you have the courage to examine the roots beneath your beliefs. May your curiosity become stronger than your fear. May your compassion become stronger than your certainty. And may every new breath remind you that there is always more sky beyond the fog. Until next time, keep wondering.